Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first annual virtual job market workshop. We're very excited to have so many of you here and some of you watching later at home. So we put together these workshops because we know that the job market is a stressful time for many graduate students. So hopefully they help you demystify the process and provide you with some helpful tips on how to succeed on the job market. So this session will be about some of the different markets that are out there. Unfortunately, there's many of them, so a session that covers all of them would be infeasible, but we've got many important ones covered. So we're going to have Marciano Siniscalchi talking about the US market and the private sector. Matthias Reinhardt from TSC will be talking about the EU market. Sergey Popov from Cardiff Business School will be talking about the UK market. Sarah Jacobson from Williams College will talk about liberal arts. And last but not least, Jeff Groen from the Bureau of Labor Statistics will talk about working for the US government. So here's how this session will work. First, each of our speakers will speak for 10 to 15 minutes about the particular market that they're discussing. Then we will have up to 45 minutes for questions and answers. So please prepare your questions. I will moderate the Q&A and hopefully we can have a good discussion going. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Marciano.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Tatiana, first of all, for organizing this and all the many wonderful activities of Economics for Ukraine. Thank you to my fellow speakers, but I guess most of all, thanks to the participants and contributors, and so hopefully this is going to be useful and informative. So I have prepared some slides that I'll be happy to share. Can people see my slides? Okay, very good. So I'm going to focus on the North American job market, and I want to be a little more specific. So this is going to be the North American, by which I mean US Canadian tenure track market mostly. And even more specifically, this means public, private research universities and business schools, because Sarah is going to talk about the liberal arts colleges, and so that's different. I'm also going to talk in somewhat less detail about the teaching track market and the private sector, because these are really also opportunities that really people should keep in mind when they when they're thinking about going on the job market, when they are on the job market, and they have their own peculiarities, and they need some sort of tweaks to one's preparation. So the North American market is very big. This is just a quote from the Joe website. I'm sure that Joe was mentioned in the previous session. If not, it's the job openings for economists. That's it's a website ran by the AEA, American Economics Association. So it's a large. This is just a large market. There's a lot of action, and so let's see if we can talk a little bit how it works, and most importantly, I guess, how to navigate it. Okay, of course, in 10-15 minutes, I cannot give you like a whole very detailed guide, but at least I want to highlight some of what I think are the most important points. Again, we're focusing on public, private universities and business schools in the US and Canada. And I'm going to start by talking about tenure track positions. And so the number one thing to keep in mind is that when these institutions hire on the tenure track market, they're mainly interested in your research. Okay. Of course, they will want you to teach, and the reason why they need to hire someone in labor economics is also because they need someone to teach their labor classes, right? So that goes without saying. But they will mostly be interested in your research activity, and when you're on the job, you will be evaluated mainly on on your research, or at least a large component of your evaluation is going to be your research. So that means that as you prepare for the interviews and the flyouts, really you should put a lot of emphasis on, presenting your work as opposed to other aspects of your, scholarly activities, such as your, TA work or your service, for example. So and again, I don't want to, repeat things that you might have already heard in the first part of the presentation, but my own take on the interviews is that, you need to have your spiel ready, but you also need to have flexibility. And one way to think about it that I find useful is to think about head, shoulders, and torso of your job market paper, right? So the head is your 30-second to 60-second summary, right? That's what you start with at the very beginning. Your shoulders are, okay, you give a little more detail, and then the torso is, of course, the body of the paper, and that's where you have to be able to go, mano a mano with the interviewers in case they start asking nasty questions, okay? And then for the flyouts, that means you need, of course, to prepare your talk, but also importantly, you need to be ready for these one-on-one meetings that you're going to have for different faculty members. And again, because the focus is going to be on research, you have to be ready to talk about details of your job market paper, but also potentially, other papers that you might have on your vita. And, I guess my rule and what I tell my own student is, if you put a paper on your CV, it better be that you're ready to talk competently about it for 30 minutes, because it could be that, you walk into one of these meetings and, the person in front of you says, hey, I saw you worked on, blah. So tell me about this. So, that's kind of, important to keep in mind. How about teaching? Okay, so here, things will be different in different departments, of course, but I would say that the general idea that in the tenure track market, the idea is that the teaching needs to be above the bar or above some bar, okay? And that bar may be higher or lower, depending on the places. I mean, students should not be storming, the chair's office complaining about your teaching, but it's not so you're not going to get tenure because of your teaching, okay? That's the important thing, okay? Now, that said, for business schools, the situation is different. The bar is definitely higher. So for some reason, there's this understanding that, business school students are paying customers and, undergraduates are not. And I mean, as a parent of a college student, I can tell you that that's just not, I don't know, it just seems insane to me. But anyway, that's the understanding. And so the bar is definitely higher. And also teaching in a business school is actually very hard. And here, my one nugget of advice, is actually coming next. So, I'll say that later. So in terms of the teaching, you need to be ready to briefly discuss your experience. So if you've TA'd a course or you've been taught a course, that's all good. We could go into more details as to what you should be able to say and what you don't need to say. My point is, don't overclaim, okay? And especially if you're interviewing with business. So the overclaiming means things like, I can teach anything. That's a bad answer, okay? And also, especially with business schools, don't say, oh, I love teaching MBAs. No, you don't, because you have no idea what that means. Okay, so and people actually get offended. I mean, my business school colleagues get offended when some of them get offended when people make these broad claims. The process, there's going to be an interview, which I think this year is mostly going to be on Zoom, which I think is a great thing, actually. Takes away a lot of the awkwardness of the in-person process. I hope it stays this way. The fly out, of course, this, I really hope that it does not end up being on Zoom. And then what I call the wait, which is where you sit around and wait for people to call you. So specific advice, and here, these are just general points, but some of them are really, I think, are important. So the one important thing to remember is that this is not a beauty contest, okay? It's a matching process, okay? So schools are going to have different needs. And the reason you don't get an offer from your favorite school is not because you're not good enough, it's because they're looking at a different field, okay? Or they don't have enough slots and they have to make choices. And so they're gonna give priority to fields where they have a greater need. And so it's really important to really keep this in mind. It's a matching process, not a beauty contest. Also, different schools are on different schedules, okay? So if your office mate gets calls before you do, it may just be that they're interviewing with schools that are on an earlier schedule, okay? The other thing is, markets will clear in waves and there will be superstars. You don't need to care about that, okay? So the fact that there are superstars, you should not be a concern of yours. The market will clear. It may take a while. You may not get an offer right away and I don't know, end of February or March. You may get an offer in April. You may get an offer in May, okay? That's just how the market works. Is it ideal? I don't know. There are certain issues with this, but it is something that's kind of important to keep in mind. And so I guess this is just my way of saying, be patient and be mindful of, I guess, let me just say broadly, of sort of your well-being and your mental health, okay? It's a tough process, okay? What helped me as I was going through the process is that once you've sent out your package, you're like, a little part of this little mechanism that's working, of its own volition. And so you just need to just go through the motions and do what you need to do. And in the end, there will be an outcome, okay? And the most important thing really is the reason you're an economics PhD student is that you want to do something that you love doing, okay? And you even get paid to do it. Eventually, you'll get paid to do it. So this is really, it's really great. It may take a while for you to land a job. One bullet point that I didn't put in, but that I also tell my students, this is just the beginning of your career. It's not the end of your career. Okay, so just get the best job you can get, just do the work you love to do, and then things will work out. It may take a few years, but I mean, there's plenty of examples of people who didn't start with what you might think of as their dream job and ended up winning the Nobel Prize. Okay, so I mean, just really, this is that. Demand and supply is different in different fields. The world is a big place. There's Europe, there's Asia. And the one sort of concrete piece of advice that I'm going to end up with, because maybe it's news for some people, never talk about money throughout the process until you get your offer. Okay, so this is just one little tidbit of advice. So just money is just off the table until you get your offers. Let me spend maybe the last 5 minutes, Tatiana, is that okay? 4 or 5 minutes? To talk about teaching track positions and private sector jobs. So just a few things. Again, this is in North America. So these are positions where the focus is laser sharp on teaching. Okay, and that's true in hiring, and then it's true once you get the job. You should typically expect to teach maybe, I guess, 4 semester length or 6 quarter length classes per year. I think this varies depending on the institution. People get hired taking their field into account. For example, there's an endless demand for econometricians and there's a very small supply. So if you're an econometrician, good for you. But the understanding is that even if you're an econometrician, if you need to teach an intro macro course, you must be able to walk into the classroom and teach an intro macro course. It's really depending on need, okay? Which of course takes a special kind of ability. I mean, this is, in principle, everyone, who has a PhD in economics should be able to teach the material, but teaching it effectively is a whole other matter. There's no tenure typical in these jobs, but there's usually, most schools have a well-defined promotion path. And the understanding is that if you do a good job, if you have a strong teaching performance, you're gonna get renewed. And in fact, you may even be poached by other institutions. I mean, it's a very active market. So that means that you should prepare with a focus on teaching. In interviews, you might be asked to give a mini lecture, like 10 minutes on some agreed upon topic. On your fly out, you will be asked to give a lecture on some, again, agreed upon topic. And people are really not going to ask you to talk about your research, or they typically won't. In fact, in general, for these positions, research is a nice to have. It's not a requirement. Okay. And so my advice here is that this is actually a great option. There's a strong demand for people who are really competent and really enjoy teaching. And so if that's you, this is really something that you should consider. Just don't assume that the best job for you is a tenure track job, because it may actually not be. It may actually not be what you enjoy the most. Okay. And finally, industry jobs. And so here I'm going to be a little, brief, but I just want to point out, in the old days, industry job meant essentially consulting or finance. Okay. And, finance, of course, was restricted to, certain fields, and consulting by and large meant antitrust litigation. So places like, Cornerstone, Charles River Associates, and so on. Much less common were, jobs in like actual management consulting, such as McKinsey and so on. So these companies do interview at the meetings. It's just, I would say less common. Over the last maybe 5-10 years, there's going to be an explosion of demand from tech companies, your Amazons, eBay, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Uber. So these companies hire PhD economists like crazy. Okay, so I actually have a sort of part-time position as what they call Amazon Scholar with Amazon, and I work with econ PhDs on a routine basis. And this can actually be a very rewarding job. Okay, it's a sort of relatively new opening for for PhD economists, but really you get the opportunity to apply economic skills to concrete problems with good data. Okay, you may actually be able to create the data, but from experiments. You need to be able to deliver solutions quickly, so you don't have to deal with referees and stuff like that. Subject to internal review, you're actually also allowed to attend conferences, present your work, and publish. Okay, and of course you get to interact with top CS people as well as top econ people. I mean, this year's two Nobel laureates are both Amazon scholars. Well, one is an Amazon scholar, the other one is an Amazon sort of external consultant. So this is just to say, this can be a really exciting line of work, and especially if you have empirical or experimental skills, this is really something that people should consider. I have a colleague at Amazon who got her PhD in economics from NYU, and her intention all along was to get a job in tech, and she did. Okay, and so this is really just something to keep in mind. Okay, and the questions I guess are going to come later.
Thank you so much, Marciano. Yes, if we can hold questions, you can jot them down or put them in the chat if you don't want to forget them, but otherwise we will wait until all the panelists have spoken. Next up, we will have Matthias Reynard talking about the EU market.
Thanks, Tatjana, and thanks for putting this together. So I have experience on the EU market from different sides. So I graduated from an EU school rather than a US school, which has its own specificities sometimes. Then I took a job in Europe at the Toulouse School of Economics, where I've been for the last 7 years. And there I've seen the other side of the market, being on the recruitment committee and also co-chairing our recruitment committee 2 years ago. And then I've also guided my own graduate students from Toulouse that went on the market and took jobs in Europe, the government sector in Europe, and the US academic market. So I think I'm going to organize my 15 minutes in 3 parts. So I'm first going to talk about the demand side in the EU market, which I'm going to talk about in 2 tiers. The first are the big research universities in Europe, and then other national universities. And then I'm going to talk about going on the market from Europe to apply for international jobs. So the first part of Europe is the top tier, which also includes some UK universities, which Sergey will cover later, I guess. But that includes like LSE, UCL, Bonn, Toulouse, Barcelona, Mannheim, Bocconi, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Leuven. All these schools have top research departments, and anything you've heard so far applies for those schools as well. So there is not much specific about applying for these types of jobs that is different than applying for top research positions in the US. These schools are looking for the best researchers that also have good teaching abilities. And so everything Marciano said in his 15 minutes and that you've heard in the previous session is applying there as well. There is one difference, I think, and that is a bit in the timing of the process. So the flyouts do take place in January and February, but the interviews do take place in December before Christmas. And that is before the ASA meetings, and that is a bit of a difference. So historically, all of the European schools and the UK schools interviewed at ASA, which meant that all of our professor teams had to fly just after New Year's to the US to interview for 3 days and then fly back, which was costly. And also a lot of European schools didn't fly to ASA, which basically left them out of the market. And so that's why in 2018, the European Economic Association organized a European equivalent of the ASA meeting, which basically groups all European universities on a 3-day conference where interviews take place just as with the ASA meeting. So that took place in 2018 and 2019 in person. And so the interviews are in mid-December. And then you do those 3 days, and then you go to the ASA meetings to do your US or global interviews with often Asian and the Australian schools. So as a candidate, that means that you need to travel or had to travel twice. But then COVID came along and things changed again, because then we all moved on Zoom. Now it's a little bit I'm a little bit in doubt what's going to happen. I'm unsure how many schools are going to participate on the in-person interview conference in Europe. So I guess some schools are going to interview on Zoom. Just as Marciano, I agree, Zoom is very efficient to do interviews. It's much less costly for us. And I think it's also much less costly for the candidates, and it gives about a similar information than an in-person interview. So I think a lot of schools will stay on Zoom, but it could be that you will have this European conference. In any case, as a candidate, you can apply also to present at the conference. There's an EEA and an Econometric Society conference that is targeted towards giving job candidates the opportunity to give a seminar as well, which is good because you'll present in front of some European faculty, and so that is good to already showcase some of your job market presentations. And so I would encourage people to apply to that conference if they're comfortable traveling mid-December. There's been some commentary on or some critique on having a separate European market, a concern that we would preempt the US market. That's not going on at all. Our flyouts are at the same period as US schools, and there are some European schools that give very fast offers, just like, or exploding offers, just like some US schools do. But in general, the EU timing after the interviews is exactly the same as the US timing, and the markets takes waves to settle, and so this offer stage can take a while. In fact, I think having the two separate dates is very helpful also for candidates, because it helps with congestion. If you have 20 to 30 interviews in 3 days, that is very demanding. If you can get your couple of EU interviews that you have on a separate moment, that is actually very beneficial. That is about the interviews. So flyouts, nothing else. There's nothing special about a flyout in Europe. I think it's exactly the same as doing a flyout in the US. The process has probably been described earlier. What is a little bit different are the job offers in some respects. So to understand why job offers are sometimes a little bit different in Europe than in the US, is that the European system grew from all of the national member states' academic systems. So France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, they all have their own national academic system, which used to have a government organized system of promotion from PhD into assistant professor. Well, assistant professor didn't even exist. And so we all had this different system of promotions. And so from those systems, the top European universities have started designing their own basically their own mimicking of a US tenure track system. And so that means that your offer is sometimes going to look weird administratively. It's going to sometimes be a patch of different things, a bit of money that comes from here, a standard wage that is lower, but that is assigned to the standard a non-tenure track academic position that you officially get, etc. So my advice about this is not to worry about this until you get the offer and then try to understand the details very well, but also to trust these institutions. All of these institutions are trying to create the best research environment that they can to attract top talent from the world. And they're trying to put effort to make this as smooth and as good for top researchers to come and to be willing to come, and you're never going to be or very seldom are going to be the first international researchers that comes to this school. So the offers might sometimes look weird, but that is because of these historical reasons. Then, of course, in Europe, academic wages are significantly lower than those you will see on US offers. I think it's good to be aware of that up front. There is a big wage gap between Europe and the US. Again, this wage gap doesn't mean that you're going to be poor in Europe. Professor wages are sufficient to have a very good life in Europe, and you are in a good percentile of the income distribution. And on top of that, you need to take into account that Europe has free healthcare, free education, and the social security system is just completely different as in the US. I mean, in net terms, US is paying higher wages for academics than Europe, but it's important to note that the net difference that you see is not the actual net difference that you'll experience in life. Then the research conditions are also a little bit different and are also bound strongly to the member states. So each of the European member states have different national funding opportunities. And so again, ask about research funding, ask how competitive the national research funds are to get, and be aware about how that works. But that depends on where you get offers. And I don't have the time to go through 15 different states of different member states and how their research funding is organized and how each university distributes the research funding that they get. So this can be very specific, but again, it depends on the country. So that is basically how I guess the big European universities, research-oriented universities, organize things. Then there is another tier of universities that do not participate on the international market. So in every European country, you have institutions that don't go to the EEA market, that don't go to the ASI market, and post jobs at different moments in time. My advice for you would be to completely ignore that market if you go on the international market, unless you have very specific regional preferences to go somewhere. So imagine that you fail your job search after a US PhD, but you do really want to go back to, let's say, Germany. Then at that point, start talking to the people you know in Germany and start looking for opportunities. It's not too late, and the openings come at a rolling basis. So just start looking at those things only when you have a very specific regional limited search. Again, these systems are all very different. France has an own job market. for maître de conférence positions. Germany also has an own system. I don't understand every system. It's very complicated. So do get information when you would want to enter that system specifically. And then the last thing I kind of want to touch base upon is going on the market with a European PhD. So given that you're listening to this session is already good, that means that you self-selected into getting information on the job market. And so that is a good thing. So I might be preaching to the ones that are already converted. But what I think is very important to realize when you're going on the market from a European PhD program is that historically we've had a lot less preparation for the job market than top US research schools have. And so you are going to go in competition with US candidates that have a very streamlined preparation on how to do their interview spiel, how to do their job market presentation, and also have established experience in seeing how research communication happens at top US institutions, which culturally dominates what we're looking for when we're screening people. And so they've basically been exposed to that type of communication for years and years. While if you come from a smaller European university, you do not necessarily have that experience. So you shouldn't be too conscious of what the competition is. And as Marciano said, you should trust your own love for economics, and that is the main important thing. But you should somewhat be aware that you start with from a position where you've had somewhat less training. And I think one way to make up for that training is to just work harder and to get every bit of information that you can get on the market. There are a lot of written guides out there. A lot of universities post online documents on information on how the market works. There's sessions like this that are organized. There's tons of information available online. And so given that you are going on the market with probably a little bit less of preparation from your own university, you should invest a lot on yourself in getting the information that you need, and ask questions to people that have been on the market before that you know, and practice especially enough, especially the interview stage, especially that is very important to practice. To give you an idea, it sounds crazy for me now, but I went on the market without official interview prep. And so my first interview preparation were the actual interviews. And so my second interview was with a top 15 US research institution. And you get an email saying, well, these are the two people that will likely interview. Of course, now it's obvious, but at that time it wasn't obvious to me. But I entered the room and there were 8 researchers, 3 who I knew their work, and I was very impressed. And the 2 that I thought would be there, that I read their papers, weren't there at all. And then they started firing questions, and I was offended by the first question because it was a question about a super standard assumption. And I thought, well, if this is a question, this is standard. But then I responded offendedly, which you never should do, and then the interview went wrong for that. And that first interview was actually my on-the-job market training, but you should get in those situations or make sure that you try to get yourself into such situations as much as possible before you do the actual interview. So coming on the market from a smaller university, if you have good letters and you have good work, you will get good interviews, but put in the extra mile to inform yourself about what the market is, and to prep yourself to explain your work and to do a good job doing that. So I guess that's my overview for what's European specific about the job market. So I'm happy to also answer questions about this later on. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Matthias. Next up, we'll have Sergey talking about the UK market.
Fantastic. Thank you, ma'am. So I've been in the UK since 2013. I worked in 2 universities and interviewed about 20 more. I participated in hiring so I kind of like I was on the panel and whatever. So I have a bit of the personal knowledge, and I work in the economics of academia, so I know a bit about data. UK is different from the US in the most important aspect is that all the universities are government. They're all state. Okay, so it was Margaret Thatcher who said, why don't we make everything state and make the best value and provide everybody with good education, and to do that we'll have the KPIs and let's see how that works out. And well, since then we didn't have a lot of English born, English raised, English working professors getting Nobel Prizes, but it is what it is. So because everything is state, because we get salaries from the state doesn't pay us a lot of salaries. For the last 10 years the salaries were flat. Because we are state, we have to work in an environment called the REF, so it's the Research Excellence Framework. And what it does is that it takes everybody's papers, calculates the number of stars, and then says, well, Cardiff University gets that many stars. So that was the simple ref about 2001. Since then it got more complicated, so now we write these huge pages of text saying how we had impact. So if you don't know what Brexit is, so Brexit is United Kingdom leaving the European Union. And the reason why it happened was that there was a professor of economics, Patrick Minford, one of my colleagues, who advocated for that in like every interview. There was an interview for Brexit and against Brexit, and for Brexit there was Patrick Minford, and against Brexit there was anybody else in the UK. And every time Patrick Minford was telling how Brexit would be amazing, and the other economist was like, oh no, it's not going to be amazing. So it's not amazing, right? But Patrick Minford created impact on the real life by taking UK out of the EU, and that's how we got an impact case. Okay, so this is part of the ref. This is how it's calculated. It's arcane, it's weird. It happens once in 6 years. It happened last year. Okay, why is it important for you? If you went on the market in the ref year, right, you would need to have papers, because if you came with 0 papers, the average papers of the department goes down. Now, if you go on the market this year, you have 4 years in front of you. If you publish 1 paper, you would be refable. You could be included in the ref report. You could increase the average ref. If you publish 2 papers, excellent. If you publish 4-star paper, excellent. If you leave the department in this last year before the ref and you go to another department, that another department suddenly will get a boost. Okay, so it's good for you to go to the UK now if you don't have any papers and you think you will get a couple of 4-star papers in the next 2 or 3 years. Okay, so knowing that ref is actually a game changer in whether you should apply to a UK school this year, right? So now you know you should. Now, like if you were considering now or in 4 years, now is probably better. Like in 4 years, it's better if you know you'll have a couple of 4 stars. How does that affect the whole application procedure? So because everything is state, universities don't have a lot of leeway in about how to hire. So what they do is they have a standardized list of required properties and desired properties. So they will not interview anybody who did not have a required property. Okay, so they give you a list: required 1, required 2, required 3, required 4, required 5. Okay, if your application does not explicitly say why you satisfy all the required points, they will not interview you. Okay, I am not talking about LSE and Oxford and Cambridge. Okay, so Matthias properly advised that they are very similar to the American universities. I'm talking about the rest of the UK, which is a huge country and a lot of jobs in there, and they are actually quite cushy jobs. Because UK is mostly a state environment, all the salaries in all the places are the same. And I promise you that you get the same salary in London and in Cardiff and in the north of Scotland and in Belfast, right? But you can buy very different things in London and in Cardiff, in the north of Scotland and in Belfast with the same money. Okay, it's not a lot of money. It's fine. It's okay money. Now, so why am I saying you this about the required things? when you prepare your pack of documents, right, the cover letter, right, the CV recommendations, right, you prepare a cover letter. How do Americans prepare cover letters? Hello, my name is Sergey. Please consider me for your job, right? What do you get in back? Oh, right? Because you did not explain why you are eligible for this post, right? So instead, you're saying, hello, my name is Sergey. As a required point one, I do have a PhD from University of Illinois given me in this year. As the required point two, explicitly, so that there is no chance for anybody to make a mistake, right? You explain for every job how you get, you check that box, okay? Desirable is good to clarify, right? So for instance, they say desirable that the person can teach macro, right? I am not a macro person, but I would say I check this box of desirable. Why? Because I can teach macro because I was teaching macro in 2006, right? They don't care about how strongly you satisfy this box. They care about whether you check the box. Because later, when the decision is between me and somebody else, whoever wants me can say, look, he can teach macro, right? Because the box has been checked, right? So check as many boxes as you can. Did you have a grant? I never had a grant, but my PhD program gave me $200 to visit a conference. That's a grant. Okay. So cover letter, make sure you satisfy all the application points. Then you might go for an interview. Most likely you will not. Why? Because they don't have the money to, go to conferences and talk to people. They might go, but a lot of them just don't bother because, well, they don't have the money and they kind of, don't really want to, they don't enjoy this process of, challenging people with strong questions about how, like, whether, correlation causes, leads to causation on the other way around. So what you might get is you might get an interview, which before COVID times was involving a fly out, or you could ask for a remote connection. Before the COVID, I would say fly out. After the COVID, I think there is no more penalty for not coming personally. Okay. So you do this interview, there are two parts. One is you are talking to the members of your department, right? And they can ask you to talk about your research for 15 minutes. They can ask you to make a practice teaching moment. They can ask, prepare a presentation about what can you bring to the department, all kinds of things, okay? Make sure that you don't just take your job market talk and you say, and you replace the front slide. Make sure you adjust it to match the time allowed, to match the audience, to match the topic. Why? Because then they will think what they report back is saying, is that person a reasonable person? Does he want to come to Cardiff? Right? And if the person just says, oh, I didn't bother to change my slides from my talk, but let me just, babble around the job. I don't think you're coming to Cardiff. You might want an offer from Cardiff to bargain it somewhere else, but I don't think we should give it to you, right? So if they ask you to present something, do that. Don't assume it's a fluff thing. That's an important thing. And then you have a meeting with a committee of a dean, of the head of economics, of a couple of more people, right? They can be, a Welsh person who looks at you from the perspective of, whether like a professor from the School of Music, right? So whose value is that he is a Welsh speaker and he can evaluate whether you can be teaching to people whose native language is Welsh, and which is not so much important in Cardiff, but it was important in Australia, right? So these guys don't know your field, they don't know your contribution of your paper. This is not a selling point with them. The selling point with them is if you make sense. Okay, so they want to look at you, right, and understand, like, this guy has an idea why he wants to be a faculty member. He has the internal drive, right? How to fail that interview, right? Number one, start talking about money. Marciana talked about that, right? So that's not the time when you talk about the money. Okay. They can ask you like who you are, what you're working on, explain to them in very simple terms. There could be a teaching head in there who could be looking at you from the perspective, can you teach to students, right? He is not looking at whether you will publish in Econometrica. He is looking at you whether you can teach to students. Make it very simple. Make it student level simple. Okay. They can ask you, what do you need, right? Be honest. What can you teach? Be honest, right? So fundamentally, be a normal person. Okay. How to fail that, I already explained. Don't, be weird, right? Am I getting an office with a window? We don't know, right? We don't know if you're getting an offer in the first place, right? So let's talk about relocation money, right? No, first you get an offer, then we talk about the relocation money. After that, they say you farewell and you wait for the decision, and that can take 2 weeks, 4 weeks, right? Even if you're the number one. It can take a day, but it can take longer. So one example of a loss of a job offer I know was from a person who wrote an angry letter, right, to the committee saying, why did you not write me back? And people who got that letter got it while typing the answer saying, congratulations, you got the job. Okay, so don't be that. They don't reply, fine. They will tell you you did not make the mark if it's time to tell you you did not make the mark. If they didn't tell you, Mark, that you got the job, you are probably still under consideration. Final minute. I was talking about interviews. There was another thing that I'm forgetting. Negotiations. So in America, you can say, can I have more money, right? I have another offer. Can I have more money? In the UK, it's a state system. You cannot have more money, but you can have a bit higher level of your salary. It's not going to be, there are consequences to that, like how much time do you have until the next promotion? But you cannot ask to not get there is a demand to pass the teaching standardization, right? So that you can teach. You cannot ask to not pass that. Okay, so there is a bit less bargaining. The bargaining is a bit more sophisticated. Generically, if you know what you're aiming for, you can do that, but don't assume it's bargaining like in the United States. That's it from me. Please type questions. I'll answer them later. There is more to talk about. I assume I'm gonna make everybody sleepy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Yes, we were covering so much ground here, and it's great. Next up, we'll have Sarah Jacobson talking about the liberal arts market.
That's me. Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you to all the speakers who went before. So first, so from my background, I am teaching at a highly selective liberal arts college, Williams College, and I got my undergraduate degree at a totally different liberal arts school called Harvey Mudd College. So there's a lot of liberal arts colleges out there. This is a sort of uniquely American phenomenon. So I just want to explain a little bit what these schools are. Even if you don't have a history at liberal arts schools, it's a setting that you might really enjoy. I find it to be really rewarding. These are schools, many but not all, in the US Northeast. There's some others scattered across the US. They're typically small. A lot of them are 2,000. Some are a little bigger. Some are a bunch smaller. They are usually privately owned, though there are some that are, I guess there are some that you could call liberal arts schools that are publicly owned. They are typically undergraduate focused, though many of them have small boutique master's programs, like we have a master's in development economics. And they're generally residential schools. And so that gives a kind of a culture. Historically, it had been that a lot of the faculty also lived near campus as well. And so that gives you this really intimate campus culture. The campuses often have, and the institutions have particular personalities, like Reed is known as being kind of this anarchist school, and Williams and Amherst are known as being like kind of traditional preppy kinds of places. But there is a sense of community on campus, and you get to be very close with your students. Your students invite you to their dance performance and their hockey game and so on. And you spend a lot of time with other faculty in various settings. So it's really, I find it to be very rewarding. So the teaching, you might, if you know anything about liberal arts colleges, you might immediately think, oh, that's the same as what Marciano was talking about teaching track things. And teaching is very important at liberal arts schools. It's something that we put a lot of heart and time into, but it's a little similar to what he was saying about business schools. I think actually teaching a liberal arts school is actually not that different from teaching at a business school, where you have to make a real effort to do it well, and you're expected to do it well, but it's not going to be the thing that gets you tenure. At a liberal arts school, the most selective ones, which I'll talk about in a minute, you're getting or not getting tenure based on your research. The teaching has to meet a bar. It's just that the bar is higher. So the teaching can be challenging. I taught as a sole instructor before I got to Williams, and I got great reviews. And then I got to Williams and my reviews were in the tank. They were the worst. So the teaching is challenging, but it can be really rewarding. We send a lot of students off to get PhDs and lots of other kinds of jobs, and we develop really close relationships with. So just a pitch that liberal arts schools are a pretty great place. A couple of good things to know about them if you don't already know these things. Because these highly selective liberal arts schools value research, but you also do a lot of teaching, there tend to be pretty generous sabbatical policies, including pre-tenure sabbaticals at the highest ranked ones. So that's pretty great. I like to say if we didn't have the sabbatical, we wouldn't be tenurable, which I think is true. Another thing that's good to know is that a lot, but not all of the schools have a kind of short academic term. So we have 2 regular semesters, and then in January we have this little thing which we call winter study. It's just 3-4 weeks. Bates has one in May, Middlebury has one in January, and so just a thing to know about the teaching calendar. You might be expected to teach that rarely, or like at Williams, we're expected to teach it every other year, and the expectations vary from school to school. So that's a thing that you might see. Another interesting feature of liberal arts schools is that faculty governance is typically a thing. So you'll see that the president and the provost and the deans are typically faculty members, usually not teaching while they're in those roles. But the idea that the faculty are governing the school, the implication for you is that while you will probably be sheltered from heavy service in your first year, you are going to be expected to do a fair amount of service, even pre-tenure. So it's just a thing to know, and different people engage to different degrees with that. Another thing that's true about many, but not all of the schools, is that many are in small, isolated, rural places. And so for Williams, we're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and a bunch of the other schools are like this as well, like Grinnell is in cornfields. So that's liberal arts schools in general. Thinking about differentiating between liberal arts schools, you can think sort of horizontally. I already mentioned different ones have different personalities, and that's a good thing to know. Some of them are really sweet and funny personalities. So it's just a thing to read up if you get to, for example, the flyout stage, maybe even the interview stage. And so if you're interviewing, it's nice to ask, tell me about your students, and the interviewers will tell you about what the personality of the place is like, and it's really kind of fun. But sort of more relevant at the application stage is thinking about the vertical differentiation. So there is a hierarchy or a ranking among these schools, and you can pretty much just go to the US News and World Report ranking of liberal arts schools, and the top schools, according to that, like the higher up in that ranking a liberal arts school is, the lower the teaching load, the higher the research expectation, the more generous the sabbatical, and the higher the salary. So the top 10 or so schools, which is the tier that I'm in, are going to have, you're going to be teaching 4 or 5 classes a year. And typically one of them is a double prep, so you teach the same class twice. And you're going to have a sabbatical. It's probably going to be a year, and the salary is going to be like not totally competitive with R1 schools, but it's going to be a pretty good salary depending on where you are. So, you know, as you go farther down, the teaching load goes up and the research expectations go down. So it's just, you know, the lifestyle changes slightly as that balance changes. And so the, you know, as you go farther up, it becomes the selective liberal arts schools and then the highly selective liberal arts schools. Okay, so thinking about when you are looking at these places to apply for jobs, you know, from their perspective, their goal when they're hiring is just the same as any other tenure track hirer. They want to hire somebody who's going to get tenure, and sort of similar to some of the things that have been said, you know, you know, they want to hire somebody who is going to be able to get tenure in 6 years, and research is usually the differentiating thing for whether you get tenure. At liberal arts schools, teaching is important, but usually if you don't like teaching, you actually leave before your tenure clock is up because you just don't really like it here. So, you know, thinking about, can I see myself at a liberal arts school? Can I see myself, you know, enjoying and engaging in that kind of environment? And then can I pitch myself as being able to be successful in 6 years? That's really what somebody is looking for when they're looking to hire. You can be a good candidate for a liberal arts school, even if you've never taught as sole instructor. Probably would be hard if you've never been a TA or had any kind of experience, but, you know, we're going to look for other signals. Basically, we think that we can help you learn how to teach, and we can get clues about how you're going to be as a teacher. We get clues from your job talk about how you're going to be in front of the classroom. We can get clues from the one-on-one meetings about how you're going to be in the office with students. So, you know, we'll take a chance on you for teaching. If your research portfolio doesn't make clear that you have a good shot at having a tenurable portfolio in 6 years, you're not going to get past the first stage. You're not going to get into the first stage. So, so still consider applying even if you haven't taught. Really think about making clear that your research is going to be ready. Similar, but slightly different from what Sergey was saying about cover letters. Cover letters can matter to liberal arts schools in 2 ways. So, you know, you're sending in your application packet. We pull applicants from all kinds of schools, from like kind of no-name schools like where I went and got my PhD, you know, all the way up. We have people from the fancy schools. We don't want to waste an interview slot on a really fancy person who's going to end up taking a job at Harvard. So we want to make sure that you are signaling genuine interest. So check your mail merge. I've seen people thrown out because their letter said, I'm happy to apply to Williams University. Like that's not going to work for us. But also try to find ways that you can, even with cheap talk, signal interest. You know, we're in the middle of nowhere. Say, I love Berkshire County. It's really beautiful there. It's like, oh, that's going to increase the chance that if we give that person an offer, they will take the job. So if you can also signal, especially if you don't have a liberal arts background, if you can also signal that you've like heard of liberal arts schools and you're like, I like the idea of liberal arts schools, that's helpful as well. So say those things to try to signal your interest in your cover letter. Especially the fancier you are, the clearer we need those signals to be. Of course, teaching evaluations are helpful to have in your packet. And very often there's a teaching statement and a DEI statement. You know, in those, I'm sure that the other panel talked about this. You want those to be as much about what you've done rather than what you think. And if in your teaching statement, if you can talk about engaging teaching and teaching that values inclusivity, that's really helpful. Some other things to keep in mind when you're thinking about interviewing. So again, this whole process is going to be very similar for the selective liberal arts schools as the regular market that Marciano was talking about. You'll find the ads in Joe. You're going to apply at a regular deadline with a packet that's going to be the same as the packet you're applying for regular other tenure track jobs. You're going to have your first round interview and you're going to have your fly out. And guess what? At your first round interview, it's going to be exactly the same, at least the first chunk of it. We're going to ask you, tell me about your research, and you're going to give your spiel. So be prepared. Don't talk down your research, and don't, condescend. So don't assume that because you go into a room of liberal arts professors that there are not research active people, because you're going to find some really great scholars there. So research first, research heavy. Most liberal arts schools are not going to ask you, especially the top tier, are not going to ask you to teach a model class or prepare a model syllabus. One thing that is a little different is that you might be asked to meet with students on your flyout. And if you do, just bear in mind that sometimes the students actually do have decision-making power. Like they can say, oh, I really like Tatiana on her interview, or, oh, I didn't like Sarah on her interview. And that might be taken into account in the decision-making. But the main thing, you want to communicate that your research is going to be up to snuff, that you're enthusiastic about this kind of opportunity, and that you can communicate clearly, because that's really what a lot of the building on teaching is about. Thinking about the first round interview, one question that I really like to ask, again, a lot of the first round interview is going to be about your research, asking you the same kinds of hard questions about your identification and so on. But then we also will ask things like, what do you see yourself teaching? And similar to Sergey, you don't want to say, I can teach anything, both because that's not helpful and it's not true. But also, I like to ask, what is your dream course? And don't say, my dream course is to teach principles of micro. Say, like, I want to teach, feminist liberation macroeconomics, or like some cool thing that you like would be really super interesting to you. You can teach things that are very niche electives at liberal arts schools. So think big and put something cool together out there. Other things, don't ask right off the bat about how you can get out of teaching. So asking about teaching course reductions in the interview stage is a bad signal. Course reductions are actually pretty hard to get at liberal arts schools anyway. The timeline is in general pretty similar for liberal arts schools as for other schools, but at the certain stages, it might be a little slow because we have to get approval sometimes from higher ups at the college. There can be this weird bureaucracy. So, just be attentive. When you interview for a flyout, you may be interviewing with college leadership, who might be, in my case, like a chemistry professor, a computer science professor, an English professor, and you have to be able to communicate similar to what Sergey was saying. Don't be weird, be clear, and communicate like a human being. And the bargaining may be strange. In my experience, my chair was bargaining on my behalf with the university, or with the college. That's a thing to bear in mind. The last thing I'll say is that, because the liberal arts school is interesting and different, a lot of us who work at liberal arts schools are willing and happy to talk to folks who are interested in it. So don't be shy about reaching out. I and many others are happy to help out. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And last but certainly not least, we're going to have Jeff Groen from the Bureau of Labor Statistics talking about the U.S. government positions.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So just a little bit about me to kind of set the context for what I'm going to say about U.S. government jobs. I'm an applied microeconomist. I would do work on labor economics and the economics of education. My PhD is from the University of Michigan in 2002, and I've been at the Bureau of Labor Statistics since 2004. For those of you who do not know, BLS is a statistical agency within the U.S. government. We produce statistics on employment, wages, productivity, and inflation. And there are about 35 PhD economists in the research offices at BLS. I'm going to be speaking based on my experience at BLS in being part of several recruiting searches, and also my impression of how other government jobs work. So the heart of what I'm going to talk about is how 3 points on how U.S. government jobs are different from academic jobs, because I assume that from the presentations already and also from your experience in various academic institutions, you kind of have an idea of how academic jobs work. The first key difference is that citizenship matters. Most U.S. government positions require you to be a U.S. citizen. A key exception is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Board and the regional banks, I believe, typically do not require U.S. citizenship. But in any case, you should pay attention to that in the job ad. Often, if citizenship is required, it'll say it. And then you should list your citizenship on your CV, at least the ones that you sent in response to government ads. The second point is that the second key difference is that research opportunities and expectations vary a lot from job to job in ways that you probably can't guess beforehand. So like Sarah was talking about, okay, well, there's very selective liberal arts colleges. They're going to have higher research expectations than lower ranked ones. Well, government ones, you may not know from even the ad, or you have to go and talk to people and find out. So so I've seen a lot of variation from very little opportunities for research to a lot. BLS, I think we're kind of more on the a lot research. We have about 50% of our time that we can devote to research, and then 50% to agency work. Another thing on research that you need to pay attention to is whether there's any restrictions on the research topics that you can explore. At BLS, we're not, because we're a nonpartisan agency, we're not allowed to recommend certain policies in our research. Typically, that's not a problem, but for some things like if you're doing research on the minimum wage, and you say, based on my findings, I think we should increase the minimum wage, that would kind of be frowned upon. You wouldn't be able to do that. Some other things to ask about when you go to, say, a flyout or even a first round interview is, how is the research environment at the particular agency? So thinking about how many research colleagues you have, BLS is nice that there's a fair number of people both within my research office and the other research offices that I could co-author with. But at other places, you might be like one of 5 or 6 people in the whole place. So thinking about how you're going to fit in, and also like what both the number and also kind of the skill background of people in the field, what fields they're interested in. And then a good way to find out about potential collaborators is asking about whether people who are there already have co-authored together, and oftentimes you can get them to give you like lists of publications and things like that. That's a good signal, better than just saying, oh yeah, we co-author together, whatever. But if you've seen evidence in actual publications, that's good. Another thing to find out about is whether they have research seminars on site at the agency, or in addition, whether there's seminars that you can go to at other institutions in the same geographic area. And finally, on research, find out about whether there's financial support for specific research components, such as traveling to conferences or purchasing software or purchasing data. One thing to mention in terms of financial support is grants. Typically, people who work in government agencies are not allowed to get money from grants, because the idea is you're already getting paid your government salary, so you don't need money from grants. On balance, I think that's a good thing, because we don't have to spend time writing grants and doing things like that. The third area that I want to emphasize about how U.S. government jobs are different from academic jobs is that the agency work varies a lot across jobs, and is different from what you might be expecting or what you have experience with. So agency work is more collaborative than teaching is. So teaching, like Tatiana might be teaching her course, I might be teaching my course, and we're not really interacting very much. But in agency work, a lot of work is done on teams, and you would be like, in with some other economists, maybe some, non-economists and people from other disciplines, and you kind of working together to solve problems and get the work done. There's often synergies between agency work and research. In my case, one example is that in 2005, after Hurricane Katrina hit the U.S. Gulf Coast, I was involved in a project to evaluate some new survey questions that were added to one of our surveys. And then I got involved in using the data to look at the effects of the hurricane, and that ended up leading to several papers that I wrote. And finally, about agency work, it's very important to show interest, just like Sarah was talking about showing interest in the teaching and in the specific aspects of the liberal arts college. Show an interest in the agency work and don't just blow it off as like, oh yeah, well, that's just what I'm going to do, but I'm really focused on getting my papers out, because people on our side are trying to figure out how committed you as a candidate would be to working with us or working in the agency. And we want people who are committed to the work as well as what their research is. Okay, so in closing, just want to mention a few other considerations that are kind of perhaps unique to U.S. government positions. One is the federal budget. So the federal budget process is somewhat annoying in that, in theory, our budgets are supposed to be approved before the start of the fiscal year on October 1st, but like in the last 20 years, it rarely is the case. So what happens is that Congress is typically going into a continuing resolution to fund the government in the first at least few months of the fiscal year, and that leads to some, at least in my case, in our case, a lot of people's cases, it leads to restrictions on sort of what's considered non-essential parts of funding, which in our case is travel and training. So if you want to go to conferences in the fall, it's often difficult, but that will probably vary agency by agency. Another thing is there is a risk of government shutdowns. Most of the time this doesn't happen, but sometimes it has. But typically, historically, government employees have gotten paid after the fact. So another consideration is teaching. Obviously, teaching is not a part of our jobs, but if you are interested in teaching, there are often opportunities to teach at universities in your local area. For instance, in DC, there's some programs that are taught in the city, and some like at universities that are, in DC or nearby. The catch is that you have to do it on your own time, but sometimes that can be arranged with your supervisors to like do it in the evening or take time off, but then make up the time elsewhere. In terms of flyouts, budgets matter in terms of flyouts. So if you're like speaking from when we interview people, we're in DC, so we say if you're going to be in DC for another flyout, let us know. If we've interviewed you for the first time or in the first round, let us know, and then we can maybe share costs. Because most agencies have a limited budget in terms of how many flyouts they can pay for. So if you're, you may not be at the top of our list, but if you're kind of in the middle, we'll kind of, we might make adjustments if you're in the area. And finally, there's not the employment structure is a little bit different. There's not a tenure track or tenure system. But there's what's called career conditional appointments, where typically in the first 1 to 3 years, you're kind of on a probationary period. But if you make satisfactory progress during that time, you could be promoted to what's called a career position, which has more job security. So summarizing the key differences between U.S. government academic jobs. U.S. government jobs and academic jobs are that citizenship matters, research opportunities and expectations vary, and that agency work varies. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you, everyone who shared their thoughts on the different markets that are out there. So now we'll transition to the Q&A portion. You can raise your hand and I will call on you. You can put your question in the chat, or you can message it to me privately if you're not comfortable asking your question publicly, and then I will read it out loud without revealing your name. So with that, let's get started.
So if everybody's afraid to raise their hands, there are some questions in the chat. We can go through them if that's.
Let's see, we've got, okay, so our Canadian European positions also posted on AEA, and I assume that's the job opening for economists.
Well, UK specific ones are not always posted on AEA. So there is a Royal Economic Society, which is like AEA for the UK. It's a Royal Economic Society. It publishes the Economic Journal, and it has its own, it used to have its own conference, and it used to have its own job market conference before the COVID. So each university must publish an announcement that they're hiring somebody by the UK laws, but it doesn't have to publish it in the AEA list. There is the Econ job market website that lists. So usually I think it's pretty cheap, and people try to make sure that their ads end up there, but I'm not sure that all of them. Now the funny thing is, Americans try to have all their ads at the same time around November. Outside of the North America, it's not necessarily the case, because you might have money in September and you don't want this money to go away. So you advertise now before the dean decides to put this money from economics to finance, or the other way around. So people sometimes get ads in the wrong time, and that does not indicate that that would be a worse job than the one that's coming during the new year. It's you know, point being, not necessarily there are other places, but there are other weird parts that, you know, timing wise, it's not necessarily that November jobs are the best jobs.
Great. And then there's a question to Jeff. What's the most common mistake to avoid tripping up the USA Jobs HR?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the specifics, but one aspect is finding out when you need to fill out the USA Jobs. Sometimes I think the way we've done it at BLS is having people who are doing the once you've been accepted for a first round interview, then you complete the USA Jobs, because there's a lot of sometimes we don't ask everybody who's just sending an application. And so one, just find out when it is, and then it's been a while. It's been a few years since I've looked at it, so I don't want to speculate on these specific challenges within the system. But timing is a key thing.
Okay, so while we wait for more questions to come in, I will ask a question to you know, Sarah and Matthias. Would it help to have your advisor call and signal that you're specifically interested in Europe or specifically interested in liberal arts? And are there other things that people can do to signal specific interest?
Yeah, so a direct personal contact is, I think it's helpful for all the jobs. So if you can get your advisor to reach out for any job, then I think that's helpful, or any of your advisors. But it definitely helps for liberal arts schools, especially if you're a person who looks fancier, but is actually interested in a liberal arts school. Matthias?
Yes, it's sick for us. I think if there is specific interest in coming to Europe, it's useful to let your advisor know that, and also to write that in in the cover letter that you are specifically interested in coming to Europe, or even a specific European country. Sometimes you have family ties or to a European country, and you're interested specifically in going back to that country, and communicating that is helpful. And well, sometimes it's when you do not have that specific tie or have any specific reason, it's again better not to say anything than to say something that actually signals you don't have any interest at all, such as saying I've been to Paris once, I thought it was beautiful. That has not much to do with living in Toulouse, and so that is not then we know you're not very informed about coming to France. So then you better saying that you're just potentially interested in taking up a job in Europe is fine, but if there's additional information that is actually making you want to move, that's of course useful. But otherwise, you don't need to send a specific signal to be considered.
Yeah, and I think, just to follow up on that, I mean, we're in our game theory, we say that cheap talk doesn't matter, but actually in the job market, cheap talk can matter if you can do it convincingly, I think. Do you mind if I just start the answer to Brooke and then see if anybody else wants to jump in?
Yes, and could you, for those who aren't joining live, could you read the question out loud too?
Totally. So the question is, when applying for schools that emphasize teaching, is it necessary to tailor the letter, giving more weight to teaching experience and weakening our research achievement in the cover letter? So it's a yes and a no, in my opinion. I mean, it depends a little bit on, so if you're applying to liberal arts schools, then you don't lessen the research stuff. You just add a paragraph where you're like, I also really love teaching. So you definitely don't want to degrade any of the stuff about research, but it's helpful to add a paragraph that's about teaching and about and I get that liberal arts is a thing and it's something I would be excited to be a part of. I know Sergey has something to say, and Marciano, I don't know if you want to say anything about the other kinds of teaching track jobs.
Yeah, just very quickly. I would say, most of the letters that I've seen, they're, they talk about the research. I mean, the application packages that I've seen, they talk about the research, but they're, when we are looking for someone and for a teaching track job, we definitely want a teaching statement, and we definitely want teaching evaluations, which is not something that we, require or that we request or expect in a for a tenure track job. So I would say that's a difference. And also, your letter writers should mention that you're interested in a teaching job. Your letter writers are probably going to talk about your research, but they will have a paragraph. You should have a paragraph where they talk about your teaching. Speaking of which, just to add to the previous answers on this, I think you really should be talking to your advisor and communicating if you have any kind of special or unusual preference or inclination, or you should just say, oh, I really would like to have a job with these characteristics, and to the extent that your advisor or your letter writers can do something about it, they may be able to. They may know people at the institutions that you really are shooting for. And I'm not talking about Harvard. Of course, we all want a job at Harvard, but I had a student this year, maybe not, okay. So I had a student this year who really wanted a job in a couple of Italian universities, and he made it very clear to me that those were the only jobs that he wanted. And so I communicated this to people I knew there, and he got a job at one of them. So this kind of communication is really very important.
One thing I would like to add to that is that if you have specific preferences, communicate it to your advisors, but be sure not to communicate it in general to everybody on the market. So make sure that your search is very broad and that keep your options as broad as possible, but that the information gets specifically communicated to the places you are interested in. And that doesn't mean that if you do not get an offer from those places that you wouldn't take a job at somewhere else. And so keep your search broad, and talk to your advisors about getting specific information, or make a tailored cover letter to places about where you are specifically interested.
Great.
Right.
Sergey, did you want to add something? Go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to add about aiming your letter towards specific universities. I was applying to 180 universities in 2011. No way I would have time to, finally aim each letter to each specific university, which is why, Americans don't care about cover letters. They just say, please accept me. Here's my CV. Here's my job market paper. Here's my advisor calling your, head of school, telling that I'm the best person ever. But what can you do to increase your chances at a specific university? The best thing you can do is actually to aim your cover letter for this specific university. There is a University of East Anglia, right? And there is a Robert Sagan in the University of East Anglia, and he is very smart, very prolific experimental person. If you're working an experimental person in experimental field, right, and you are applying to University of East Anglia, and you are not saying I want to work with Robert Sagan, right? You're saying I'm going to come to you guys and teach you how to do experimental economics, right? You're done. You're applying somewhere where you have no idea who's working there. Not only you don't know the place, but you also don't know people in the field who are working in this place, right? So maybe if you care about a specific place, aim your cover letter towards a specific place, but don't spend too much time on that. Try keeping your letters short. How many applications people get for, workplaces? Thousands, right? There is like 4 people who are reading them, right? If you write 5 pages about how you really want to work in this place, they might not even start reading that, right? So like keep it, 1 page long at maximum. But if you really want to go to that specific place, yeah, go ahead and target your cover letters and your teaching statements toward that specific place.
Great. Question came through direct message. This is a question to Sarah. I completed my master's degree in a metropolitan area in Europe and did a PhD in a college town in the US. I prefer my experience in Europe more. What is life as a professor living in a small college town in USA, such as Williamstown, like?
So it's a little bit choose your own adventure. So I love, I live in the woods and I go out running in the woods and I walk across town and I see my students and I see the other faculty members that I know. Like it is a community environment. There aren't a lot of restaurants in town. A lot of people I know, a lot of us get our hair cut outside of town because they don't trust the 2 or 3 barbers that are here in town or whatever. So it is a very particular experience, but there are people who find ways to keep themselves happier when that kind of lifestyle doesn't work for them. And the liberal arts world is beginning to understand that to get a more diverse set of professors, we need to make that more feasible. So, I know some people who live a good distance away and commute here, or who keep a pied-à-terre in even New York, which is a few hours away, or Boston, which is a few hours away. So, I think you can customize it if that living in the middle of nowhere life doesn't work for you. And like, again, the level of engagement with the student who invites you to her dance performance at night, you can choose whether you want to do that. But if there's no part of that sort of living in, living at least with 1 foot in community that appeals to you, then the liberal arts life might not be of interest to you. There are other liberal arts schools that are in cities. So, Occidental is in Southern California, the whole Claremont cluster, and so on. So there are some, but it is a different lifestyle to some extent, though you have options.
Great. Questions? Okay, we'll ask a question to Jeff. What does agency work involve? Can you talk a little bit more about what people might be expected to do for the government as part of their work for the government?
Yeah, let's see. I'll speak first from my experience, and then I'll try to remember, I guess, what other how it might work for other agencies. But for BLS, we're often working on surveys or some administrative data collection and kind of either like developing new questions for surveys or evaluating the quality or looking at studying like non-response bias, or merging the survey data with some administrative data and comparing how do they compare, taking different items from different surveys and comparing them. Other places you might want to look at, like, the budgetary impacts of a proposed law, and or how is this particular aspect of the tax code affecting behavior. So you might be writing kind of like an academic style report, but for a particular, maybe a congressional audience, or um, audience like that. I know, like, people at the Federal Reserve, their focus is kind of forecasting and preparing briefings and things for the FOMC meetings. So advising the Board of Governors on whatever they need to make decisions. They typically have like certain parts of the economy that they focus on.
Great.
So some
Dominic?
examples.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of piggyback on that because we don't really have a good pipeline to the government where I'm at. So I was wondering, like you mentioned, like how you should figure out, what the agency does. And so, if I said FTC or something, most people would probably think IO or something. But it turns out the two people I know who work at the FTC, one's a health economist, the other one's she does gender inequality stuff. And so she was also surprised herself. She's like, I can't believe the FTC hired me. So what's like a good kind of strategy for kind of figuring out what the agency work actually is, and as opposed to what we think it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you apply initially, it's probably hard to tell. Well, obviously look on the website. If you know anybody, you can ask. But I think I guess my focus would be on, like, when you have an interview, a first round interview, if you get selected, then you can, ask. They'll probably tell you, they'll probably, be approaching you and telling you, this is what we were looking for, somebody to work on this survey or whatever. And just showing interest in the interview. And then if you come for a flyout, there'll be probably more opportunities of meeting people one-on-one, and just asking and being open when people are going to present to you what they might want you to work on. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. I mean, yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Sergey?
So I think what you could do is to make it into your cover letter, right? So I want to do blah, and BLS is the best place for me to work in because blah, right? So for instance, if I wanted to do labor, you've got the best data, right? If I want to do education, you've got the best data. Maybe you don't, but then we're going to marry your data with these other people's data, and I know these guys. And then it's actually makes sense for BLS people to get you in, because now they know that you are coming there, not because they advertise the salary, but because you actually want to do something specific that you would be useful in that place. And I am sure they will bring you a committee of, this person who does this weird thing and this person who does that weird thing. And we can do all kinds of things. And we already tried collaborating with Center for Disease Controls, right? So like they will also help you come up with new ideas. But why would I go work in BLS? That you need to answer in your cover letter and explain to them that you are the best thing that they can hire this year.
So you would say, and Jeff, you can comment on this. You would say, like, kind of like we do when we apply to grad school. We say, oh, I want to be, a development economist for this reason. It it's not necessarily a contract, but it just shows we're interested in, even
I
if
am a
it's not
labor
what-
economist who wants to work at these specific things. I want to work with you guys because you have the data.
Okay,
right?
so just
So
okay.
it's a bit better. It's a bit better. I don't like. I never worked in labor, but if you hire me in BLS, I will totally work in labor.
Okay, so it is selling yourself, but you're not really making
Right. So
a
like if
contract
you're
with-
writing like I'm a theoretical, person who is talking about limited rationality, and why don't you hire me in BLS? Because well, maybe we do something about labor about it, but that's not gonna fly. But yeah,
Okay.
in,
Do you have
in
anything
like
to add
PhD
to that,
applications,
Jeff?
it could fly. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just there's some talk about trying to make yourself look attractive in a cover letter, and I think some of that is valuable, but I don't want to don't overdo it. Like maybe just think about how could you fit in. Don't apply to agencies where you think you wouldn't fit in. I mean, a lot of in our cases, I don't think we spend a ton of time studying the cover letter. We're kind of looking at, what field are you in, and the quality of the research, and then we might invite you for an interview, and then it's at that point where I think showing an interest in trying to find out what we're all about, that's when it matters. So
Thanks. Okay, we got another question by direct message. Suppose your top priority is to have the colleagues' freedom, time, funding to continue your job market paper research agenda. Would there be a specific order of the job types to consider, or is it dominated by within type variation / idiosyncratic topic job matches?
I would say within type. I'm curious what the others think, but I think that within liberal arts schools, within government jobs, there are jobs where you're expected to spend a huge amount of time doing research and not that much time, not as much time doing other stuff. So that's my feeling. Other folks?
Yeah, I mean, it will have to be, mainly about, who's where, which of your colleagues you think, you'd enjoy, which faculty member you enjoy working with the most. But I guess, on this question, I mean, it's a very good question. My general advice to students at this stage is that this is the time to gather offers, and then the time to ask questions like this is once you have collected those offers. So don't be selective ex ante, be selective ex post. That said, it is a very good question, and in fact, I think it is in some sense the most important question you should ask yourself. Like where can you be the most productive? When can you do your best work and be happy and gratified with your job?
I think there's also another reason about only looking at offers. I think there's two-sided learning going on. Like the schools learn about the candidate's abilities, but as a candidate, you're also going to learn a ton about the work environment and the colleagues at different places where you get flyouts. And so to consider about your options after you have offers and after you have spent more time there, getting the atmosphere and learning more in detail about who's there and what the different conditions are. And that's going to provide you with a lot more information than you ex ante think you have now about these 100 different options. So that should help also with ranking.
Great. Okay, so I think we'll end on this
Just a little
final.
thing. If you have a preference, don't tell that to the hiring committee. Okay, so never say you are the number 2 in my classes of preference. I will accept a normal job, but a teaching college would be fine for me as well. So at that moment, every teaching college will file you in a circular cabinet, if you know what I mean. So what you want to say to them is that you want to hire me and I'm the best thing you can hire this year, and here is why. Okay, so for instance, you're working on the bounded rationality. You apply to Northwestern, you are saying there is Marciano. We will work together. We will publish a lot of econometrics, especially Marciano, right? So you apply to Williams College, you're saying there is nobody who is teaching bounded rationality in there, and I can teach bounded rationality to liberal arts students, and here's how I'm going to do that. And you are not only you are not teaching that, but other colleges are not teaching that, and you will be the first one who is teaching that. And then there will be so many people who will go further, bringing bounded rationality to all kinds of things. And have you heard about the Nobel Prize winner in 2014? Blah, 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 right? Everybody needs to think that you are the best thing that they can hire. Do not tell them that you are not the best thing that they can hire, okay? Even though you might not agree with that, that's not your job to belittle yourself. Your job is to sell yourself.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much. So we'll end on this last question for Jeff. Does someone working in governmental agencies or international organizations have less opportunity to explore the research topics she wants? Do people working in these places consume a lot of time in administrative things?
Like I said, it depends agency by agency. I don't think the restrictions are really that great, but you do need to kind of get used to being in, kind of a chain of command that there's probably going to be a supervisor you have to show your research to and talk to your research, show your research before it goes out. But there may not, I wouldn't necessarily judge all government agencies to be like onerous places to do research. And then Tatiana, can you repeat the second part of the question? I don't remember.
How much time do administrative things consume?
Oh, if you're not a manager, not very much time. But typically, managers do the management administrative stuff. The other people don't do that much administrative stuff. Great.
Okay, so I think we will stop here. Thanks very much to all our panelists for great presentations, and thank you to all the participants for coming. Hopefully this was helpful as you start on your job market journey. We will have another workshop in mid-fall focusing on interview strategies, and another one tentatively in early December, focusing on flyouts and negotiating offers, because we know you'll all be too busy in January to attend workshops, so we'll get those done early. You will all receive notifications about those workshops as well, but if there's any other students that might be interested, I will send out a link to the recording after this, and also more information about how to sign up to be notified about the future workshops.